Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Cipher Brief Digital Studio. This is editor-writer Ethan Masukal. Today, we're going to be talking about critical minerals, sort of a rundown on what the topic is, since it's been in the news lately because of negotiations with Ukraine. And joining me today to discuss this is Fabian Villalobos, Senior Engineer at RAND and Professor of Policy Analysis at the RAND Graduate School of Public Policy. Fabian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So just to start off, basically, for a lay person, what are critical minerals? Uh, what are the criteria for something to be designated as a critical mineral?
Each country has its own definition of what a critical mineral is. From the U.S. perspective, it relates to restricted access to these domestically. That means import reliance on other countries for these mineral inputs for various manufacturing sectors. It also has a component of the ability for that foreign dependency for that other country to continue to supply the United States reliably into the future. And so there's a domestic component to it. There is a foreign component to it, and there's also an economic impact component to it as well, in terms of the importance as an industrial input for the various parts of the U.S. manufacturing sector.
Right. And then, so breaking down sort of the uses of critical minerals, can you talk about the national security applications of how they're uh, used in that manufacturing capacity?
So the U.S. has a list of 50 critical minerals. There are, depending on which mineral we're talking about, there are a variety of use cases. The where a lot of the national security concerns stem from are those that have dual use applicability. As you might expect, there are a variety of applications for each individual mineral. For depend and they fall on different ends of the spectrum for those applications. In the case of lithium, for example, that is a large application is coming from demand for lithium ion batteries, and that could stem from electric vehicles or stationary energy storage systems, for example. In the case of something else like tungsten, that's a metal that's that the defense and aerospace sector relies upon for high temperature components, for example, in jet engine turbines and these types of things. So there's a spectrum of utility on there, and each mineral will have different demand signal from there. But as you can imagine, batteries and all are in all kinds of military systems, whether it's a drone, right, that's flying over Ukraine, or if it's an electric vehicle within the United States. If we're talking about semiconductors, then gallium and germanium then become the focus. And in that case, that could range from gallium arsenide wafers that are used in some of these more advanced chips, or it could be within a sensor, within a satellite, for example, or even in the solar photovoltaic system that powers that satellite in outer space. So these minerals are everywhere, and most Americans don't really think about the dirt that comes out of the ground that then becomes a value added chemical product that as a manufacturing input and into all kinds of applications. So these things are all around us, and as you might imagine, they're all around the military equipment and weapon systems as well.
Uh, I think that's putting it lightly that they're everywhere from how you ran through that. So you mentioned both domestic and the foreign component on how these are designated as critical minerals. So what is the U.S. access like to these different minerals? Are there some areas where we're lacking more? Or are there some where like the need is higher, so it's uh, yeah. Break that down for us.
Yeah, so it'll depend on each of these 50 different minerals. there'll be different import reliance for them. At the top of those lists are stuff like graphite, where there's close to 90, like over 95% reliance on imports from China.
Mhm.
Um, you'll see a recurring theme here in that many of the imports for gallium or germanium, like I just mentioned, those are being imported by China or from China. Um, and moving on to tungsten as well. The main focus is that there's Chinese dominance in these in at least one of the nodes in these value chains. So within there's different parts of this value chain, as you might imagine, extracting these things out of the ground. There's the processing of those into a concentrate that is then refined into a metal or a precursor for an intermediate chemical that is then used as by manufacturers to create these components that go into either a battery system, an electric vehicle, an electric motor that might be in a wind turbine, into a semiconductor that's used into the solar cell in a satellite, for example. So if we're talking about an entire value chain, there is in many of these cases there is dominance by China or by other countries at one point in those in that value chain, and so that choke point, that node can act as a choke point from which an export control or an export ban could then restrict the access for U.S. Industry to be able to consume those components and continue to manufacture those their products for consumers, whether they be civilian consumers or military consumers.
Right. And we're seeing that with some of the export controls that have come out from China, gallium, germanium, as you've mentioned.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
Is China's dominance in this sector sort of just geological fate, or is it, has China like invested more in, for example, refining than the US? Or does it just make more sense that China is like the location where this is happening?
It's a combination of globalization in terms of pushing manufacturing onto the Chinese mainland, but there are also natural. China also has natural endowments of rare earth elements. For example, graphite is another example, where they won the geological jackpot for those things, and so they have a comparative advantage in developing those mining industries. When you move up the value chain into the refining sector and the production of intermediate chemicals, then a lot of the industrial policy that China uses for its economic development model, which is different than the more market-driven economies, those have stimulated overcapacity in a lot of these mineral industries, and that overcapacity then creates a supply glut, and that impacts prices, creates price volatility, and creates a lot of uncertainty for industry. And so a lot of the concerns that ultimately stem from this are centered around industries. The uncertainty and risk that is faced by industries that are reliant on these mineral inputs.
Mhm. So, despite China's dominance, what are the other sources that the US can get critical minerals from? Specifically, like, are there allies and partners, traditional allies and partners that are similarly endowed with these resources? Or are there other sources that are not exploited yet?
Reliance, we do have a reliance on traditional allies and partners for some of these, and that's not a bad thing. In cases where we have more reliance on China, then we really want to leverage those allies and partners. We have access to some of those materials domestically, and developing those domestic resources makes sense. makes great sense. And where allies partners come in is where we don't have access to those particular materials. So in the a lot of the domestic projects are slow to move in terms of producing material. There's a long permitting process that delays new projects from opening up, and so other countries can move faster. And if those countries are our friends, then we can supplement our needs in the near term with supply from friendly countries. Canada, for example, our neighbor to the north, has access to a variety of materials and has been moving into this space. It's received some the benefit of the Defense Production Act Title III funding. If we're talking about Australia, another close ally within the Five Eyes network, that has received the Defense Production Act Title III funding as well to develop source processing and refining of rare earth elements within the United States. And there's also other traditional allies in Europe, Japan, Korea. They've all expressed similar concerns of restricted access and dependency on China, and they also have likewise. They also have their policies that are aimed at diversifying their supply chains, whether that's within that allied network, or within non-traditional allies, for example, developing countries that are well endowed in with these natural resources. So that could include Mozambique, for example, for graphite, the Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt and copper. Indonesia is a large exporter of nickel now. The Philippines has a similar geological resource to Indonesia, so a lot of copper, nickel, and cobalt that might be located there, and then some other folks as well. So you can take a trip around the world, and you can note who has what, and you'll be very likely to have an opportunity to develop a relationship there. There is a main policy apparatus, that a diplomatic tool in the Mineral Security Partnership that includes 14 countries that are working to reach out to both the private equity world and these mining projects throughout the world to meet and to help hopefully develop these projects and produce these materials outside of the control of either Chinese state-owned enterprises or private firms.
Right. So it seems like there are options for the U.S. It doesn't seem to be all. It doesn't have to all be made in China. But I think you touched on it takes a while for these operations to get going. I imagine from identification of like a resource to full production of a mine, it takes quite a while. So I guess that also underscores the point of like we need to move fast, right? We need to move now.
So there's in these areas where there's been export bans, for example, they did not come without warning. Earlier in this year, in 2025, there's a number of export bans on tungsten, I think iridium, and a couple of other things. These export bans on gallium, germanium, and tighter restrictions on graphite came out in December of 2024. But before that, there were export restrictions that increased the number of licenses that exporters out of China would need to apply for. And so, if you were a firm in that industry that was exporting those materials, you had warning that these increasing restrictions were underway, and they're largely in retaliation to U.S. restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductor chips semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and some other inputs. And so, by seeing this escalatory trade and technology competition between the U.S. and China, there's a notice that these export bans could be coming along the way. And so, companies are smart. They're not going to sit around and wait until one of these export bans hits them. Maybe a decade ago or years ago, companies were caught off guard in with respect to this as an economic tool of economic statecraft. But nowadays, companies are a lot smarter and moving faster in terms of trying to mitigate these disruptions to their supply chains. And that's probably a development that was also contributed to by the COVID-19 pandemic, and its ability to disrupt supply chains globally. So this economic factor kind of coincided with that larger supply chain disruption environment, and so companies are smart companies are looking at ways to mitigate these. Others are I think the fear is that without a sustained policy initiative or something a bit more with a bit more bite to it, a bit more teeth to it, that in the long run these companies will then return back to their profit seeking old ways in which they look for the lowest cost supplier, which leads them back to China.
Right, right. So then, final question to you, Fabian. If you were to give a grade to how the U.S. government is currently approaching the critical minerals question, what would you put it at, and what advice would you give them?
I would focus on kind of 5 areas where these policies can touch upon. One is on the incentivizing new supply and new demand, right? And so new supply in terms of subsidies or industrial policy support. You see a lot of that coming out of Korea and Japan. These are countries that have a strong history of industrial policy and support for their industries. I think the U.S. can learn from those point of views. Incentivizing demand has been an area of where the Inflation Reduction Act tax incentives have been able to stimulate demand for at least the battery minerals that go into electric vehicles. The second part of policy that I would focus on is in lessening the control of Chinese state-owned enterprises and non-state firms over the existing companies in these supply chains. And so that foreign entity of concern language that is within the Inflation Reduction Act stimulates the divestment of Chinese firms out of the control of these companies. The other one would be the third area would be for innovating past these dependencies on critical minerals. So if you have a substitute component that no longer is dependent on tungsten or graphite or any of these minerals that are on the list of 50, then you can get past that dependency and potential choke point. The fourth would be working with your allies and partners, whether that's through reducing trade barriers, whether that's through cooperation on technology transfer or knowledge sharing in these areas, greater cooperation on standards that these companies need to operate under. For example, could diversify away from China, and then the last area would be on crisis management and risk analysis. So I think that's an area where there's a lot. There's been a lot of progress in that. There's many of the many of the organizations within the interagency have these analytical components that have been focused on this problem for quite some time, and so that's some great progress. The crisis management in terms of what to do when this thing hits you, when a supply disruption hits you, I think we can learn a lot from what Korea is doing in terms of their crisis management legislation that was passed in 2024. And then the very last area where we could actually learn from China is in the areas where we are dominant. For example, in copper, right? Is how to maintain that dominance with it and not lose market share within those types of supply chains. So overall, there's 6 areas where you can diversify your supply, and we're at various stages of policy implementation across those 6.
There you go. Well, thank you very much, Fabian. You've given lots of marching orders for both government and the private sector on this issue. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Excellent. Thank you for having me.